Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
All right, we are live.
Good evening, everyone. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute Section 13D.021, in the current state of emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic and emergency executive order 2118, this work session of the Independent School District 279 School Board will be conducted via electronic means, internet video conference. Superintendent Corey McIntyre and myself, Board Chair Kelsey Dawson-Walton, have determined that due to the health pandemic and emergency declarations, a meeting format allowing for in-person attendance by the school board and superintendent is not practical or prudent for this work session. Members of the public may monitor the meeting electronically by streaming online from the district website. An archived copy of the video recording of this meeting will also be available on the district website. The purpose of the school board work session tonight and all the time, is to build trust and teamwork, to exchange information, and when applicable, to provide direction in order to facilitate efficient and effective decision making at regular board meetings. The outcome of this evening's work session will be the board members will receive information on the Enrollment Capacity and Management Advisory Committee, ECMAC, the summary of progress, and the Building a Better Future Study Group update. To acknowledge attendance this evening, I'll ask that board members please respond when I call your name. Director Thomas Brooks.
Present.
Director Tamara Grady.
Present.
Director Heather Douglas.
Present.
Thank you. Director Jackie Mosqueda Jones.
Here.
Director Tanya Simons.
Here.
And I, myself, Kelsey Dawson-Walton, am present. Superintendent McIntyre, the superintendent's cabinet, and other district administrative staff are also logged into this video conference. And I will now ask Superintendent McIntyre to facilitate the agenda items for this evening's work session. So I'll hand it over to you, Superintendent McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair Dawson-Walton, and good evening, board members and members of the cabinet and other district staff. So tonight we're excited to share with you a number of updates on some work that's been happening for a number of months now, and specifically we're going to hear from our Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee on their year-end review, and also an update on our Building a Better Future study group's work. Our ECMAC committee has just completed their 4th year of work as they look at our current and projected enrollment and capacity conditions across the district. Tonight, you're going to hear a short presentation that summarizes the year-end review document, which was prepared to communicate the work that's occurred this year, which you know has been very unique because of the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll also receive tonight a monitoring report update on the progress to date regarding our Building a Better Future study groups. And please note the work's not done yet, but we thought this was a good point in time to give you an update on the work that's been completed over the last few months. So to jump right in, to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Meyer, our Executive Director of Finance and Operations, for our first agenda item tonight regarding our Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee year-end review. Ron?
Okay, thank you, and good evening, Chair Dawson-Walton, Superintendent McIntyre, school board members, cabinet members, and members of the community. The purpose of this presentation, as Corey just mentioned, is to give a brief overview and summarize the work that occurred in the 2020-2021 school year through the Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee, or ECMAC. Included in your board packet, starting on page 29, you will see a year-end summary report, and that goes into greater detail on our work from this year. And I will be referencing several components throughout our presentation this evening. In this report, you will see the impact of the global pandemic woven throughout the work that we did this year through ECMAC. So to start off with, I just want to ground us on what the purpose and the role of ECMAC is, which started its work. The first year of work was back in the 2016-2017 school year. The purpose of the Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee is to increase community trust in long-range planning for enrollment and building youth. The ECMAC group will analyze information affecting enrollment, capacity, and building youth, and generate observations and recommendations to be communicated back to district administration. This group was originally formed to give our community a behind-the-scenes look at how we determine facility needs related to enrollment and capacity across our district. So this group back in 2016-17 was born out of recommendations that came from an enrollment and capacity task force that occurred back in 2015. This task force also created the framework that's on your screen, which still guides our work today. And there are a few things that I just want to point out for you to take notice. First, the purpose that we just reviewed is indicated at the top. And the second thing to really take notice is right in the center of the diagram, and it's the students at the center. And this really illustrates that the work that we do through ECMAC is centered on our students throughout our work. So each word, color, and placement of items in this framework has meaning. The outer cycle that you see represents the new process for our long-range planning around enrollment and capacity. The dark blue roles around the side, the right-hand side, indicate the work to be completed by our ECMAC group. This group will collect data that is generated by our staff. They'll analyze that data, and then they'll generate some observations and recommendations. You'll see that this evening. The light blue roles around the left-hand side indicate the work that's completed by our administration, our superintendent, and our school board. That work is to communicate the work of the advisory committee, to engage the community when change is recommended or when input on decisions is needed, and then to integrate the work into the strategic plan and the long-range financial planning process. And then the outer cycle and the inner cycle will interrelate as new data emerges and as fed into our advisory committee as recommendations are operationalized through the strategic plan and the budget. And this certainly was the case with new data that came in that was different than some of the trend data that we have seen in previous years. So each year as we get started and we have new members with ECMAC, we take some time to remind those that are returning to the work for multiple years, but also to train any of our new members on really what that main role is for our group. As we saw in the purpose statement that I described earlier, ECMAC is responsible to analyze data and then to make observations and recommendations related to enrollment capacity, and then make those recommendations back to our district administration. So we spend some time each year at our first meeting really going through and discussing the need for our committee to also come together to take a school district approach versus a district of school approach to the work. So put simply, this encourages our members to try to come to the table with a district-wide perspective on what's best for the district as a whole. And again, centering on the students as the center of our work versus their own unique personal situation or perspective that they may bring to the table. And then we also remind members that the work of ECMAC often intersects with other facility planning work that may be happening. This is especially true as we are engaged in our Building a Better Future process that you're going to hear a little bit more later on this evening. The work of these other planning teams may impact the work of ECMAC, and flexibility is really the key for ECMAC as we go through our work. And finally, the last thing that we talk about and really go through with our group is to remind our members that ECMAC is an advisory committee versus a decision-making group. So our members know that while the observations and the recommendations that they make each year are highly regarded and valued and oftentimes are implemented, as has been the case in prior years with some of the recommendations, their work is not decision-making, but rather advisory in nature. So the makeup of our committee this year very closely resembles the makeup that we've had in previous years. So this year we had 18 community members, we had 12 staff members, and then actually this year we had 3 board representatives. Typically we only have 2, but because we had a change in committee assignments in January, we actually had 3 board members that participated this year in our ECMAC work. We also have members from Wold Architects and Engineers that participate in this work and is very important to the work. So I want to take a few minutes to summarize some of the enrollment data and the projections that ECMAC reviewed this year and that they made the observations and recommendations on. Much of this data can also be found in the year-end summary document that is included in the board packet that I mentioned earlier. So this first slide is in the board packet for the slides. It's not in the year-end document, but it is a document that we reviewed with ECMAC that board members have seen previously, and it's the results of a survey that was facilitated by the AMSD, or Association of Metropolitan School Districts. And it shows the decline in enrollment due to the global pandemic that was widespread across Minnesota. So this data was completed in October of 2020, so last fall. And so because it's October, it doesn't completely reflect our actual official enrollment projection data that we use to do our enrollment projections, which, as you recall, is based on November 1st data. But I did want to show it because it does highlight the impact of COVID on our school district as well as other AMS school districts. So you can see about 3/4 of the way down, I have it highlighted in a yellow circle, that as of October, we were 675 students below what our projection was for October of 2020. And then 217 students below projection just at kindergarten level alone, which represents 13.5% decrease from what we had projected. This slide shows what we had projected at each grade level and school for the 2020-2021 school year. This is, as you can see on the top right-hand corner, this is for fiscal year 2021. And these are projections that we made in December of 2019. So it was well before we knew the gravity and the impact of what the pandemic would do as it relates to enrollment. At the elementary level, you'll see midway through the document, we projected 9,337 students. At the secondary level, we projected 11,285 students for a total enrollment projection of 20,883. And then as we go to this next slide, which you can actually find on page 43 of your board packet, it shows what our actual enrollment was this year as of November 1st. So this, at the elementary level, you can see about halfway down again, we had actual enrollment of 8,762 students. We had at the secondary level 11,073 students and a total of 20,075 students. And then again, as we go to this next slide, this again is in your board packet, so you can look into greater detail. But this chart shows the variance between what we had projected a couple of slides ago that I showed you back in 2019 and comparing it to what our actuals were. So a couple of things that I want to point out, as you see in the top left-hand part of this chart in the green shaded box, it represents any school and grade level that was 10 students or more above projection. Then the pink shaded box right next to it, you see that's circled in green, represents any school and grade level that was 10 students or more below our projections. Then on the far right of this chart, you'll actually see the school level. And so you'll see on the top right-hand corner where the green shaded box, it's any school that is 5% or more above projection for that school. And then the pink you see right below it represents any school that is 5% or more below our projection. So you can see across the board in a number of our schools and in a number of our grade levels, we were below what we had projected, which aligns with the overall totals that we just looked at and talked about. This chart shows the total 5-year enrollment projection by grade level. This projection is based on the updated November 1st, 2020 enrollment, which was impacted by COVID. As we saw in previous slides, the total enrollment for FY21, the actual enrollment as of November 1st, was 20,075, which was 663 students less than the previous year as of November 1st. You can see in the columns to the right the 5-year total enrollment projection for each of those years. Now, this includes the assumption that we have previously discussed with the school board through our budgeting process that we would recruit 50% of the students we lost to COVID in FY22 and another 25% in FY23. And as you can see here, while enrollment is projected to increase in fiscal year 22, it is anticipated to decrease the final 4 years of our projection model. The columns below show the total student increase or decrease for each of these projected years. This set of data, also found with a more comprehensive detail on page 46 of your board packet, breaks down the fiscal year 22 data into individual schools and grade levels. As you can see, at the elementary level, the total is projected to be 9,035 students. The middle school is projected to be at 4,464 students. The senior high level is projected to be 6,571 students, and the total K through 12 enrollment is projected to be 20,299 students for FY22. This was also the enrollment projection that we use as the basis for our budgeting process. Once ECMAC went through and analyzed the data from our enrollment and our projections, we then looked at how the enrollment projections compared to the capacity that was established at each of our buildings. For additional information on how capacity is actually calculated at each building, which we have talked about with the board in previous work sessions, you will find a thorough overview in Appendix D of the year-end review. In the first column, you see the fiscal year 22 enrollment projections that we just looked at in the previous chart. In the second column, you see the final year of the 5-year projection model, which is for this year, fiscal year 2026. In the middle column, you see the total you actually see the total capacity for each of the buildings as we talked about, that's in your Appendix D. In the next column over, you see the total students and the percentage of over or under capacity for fiscal year 22. For projections that are over capacity, you will see them actually in red. And then the last column is for total students and percentages of over or under capacity for that out year of the projection model, that fiscal year 2026. And again, those projections, any of those that are over capacity or projected to be over capacity, are indicated in red. One important thing to note in this chart is that Rice Lake Elementary, because the addition has not yet been completed, the extra classroom space that we are adding on has not been calculated into our overall capacity. So in this chart, it is showing as red for being over capacity, but because the board approved the building addition and we are in that process, once the space opens up in hopefully in January of 2022, Rice Lake's enrollment will actually be below capacity. This final data slide shows a comparison of enrollment projection in that out year of the projection model, fiscal year 26, to the Department of Education's guidance related to core spaces. In this case, we're looking specifically at media center space and cafeteria space at each school. So the first column on this chart shows the number and the percentages of students above capacity in the media center spaces. In red is where they're indicated. Anything below capacity for media center is actually indicated in black. So as you see on this chart, as of our current projections, only Park Center Senior High is actually projected to be over capacity according to media center space. And that's really based on the square footage for that media space. So that's been a continual thing that has been over capacity in terms of the Department of Education's guidance for media center space. And then the next set of data on the right-hand side looks at the number and percentage of students above capacity in the cafeteria space, which is anything over capacity is indicated in red and anything below capacity is indicated in black. So as you can see here as well, both Maple Grove Senior and Osseo Senior are currently the only two buildings that are projected to be in FY26 over capacity related to cafeteria space. Again, based on that guidance from the Department of Education, which really looks at square footage in those spaces. Typical review of enrollment and projection data that we just summarized. The committee also looks at other data that may come, important developments that could affect enrollment and capacity at school districts, at our specific school district. And so there's a couple of considerations that ECMAC reviewed this year. The first one is 279 online. As our school board knows, the district plans to roll out this new option for families in the fall of 2021. So ECMAC heard from Assistant Superintendent Michael Lehan, as well as Executive Director of Technology Anthony Paternos, regarding this new offering and how it may impact enrollment at our physical buildings. This new program is a comprehensive K-12 online full-time school, and the cap for enrollment is 2,011 students. And this is a 4-section at the elementary level as well as 5 sections at our secondary schools. And while initial enrollment numbers did not necessarily reach the cap, this opportunity does continue to remain open for families to choose the option if they're interested. And so as it relates to enrollment and capacity, we know that for any student that enrolls in this new online program will not be in a physical space. And so it will have an impact on our future enrollment and capacity in our buildings. The second consideration that ECMAC learned about this year is the future development in the Northwest Maple Grove area. This is an area that the school district has been watching closely for a number of years. And as our school board members know, the district owns land in that Northwest area that could be used for a future elementary school if the enrollment warranted it. While the city has been anticipating growth in this area for a number of years, until recently, we have not actually seen any movement with actual development and homes coming in this section of the city. Earlier this year, and actually it was late in 2020, we were made aware that a proposal was made for development, which is being called the Evanswood development. It's a parcel of land off Troy Lane and 101st Avenue, which actually is adjacent to the land that the school district currently owns. Initially, the proposal called for 358 single-family homes, as well as 150 homes on this plot of land. This concept did go to the Maple Grove Planning Commission in January, And after some back and forth with the city council and some adjustments and alterations made, it was approved by the city council actually just recently on May 3rd. So the current information that we have from the city is that construction is likely to start either later this year or early next year. So just to get the board a better sense on this area that we're talking about, Troy Lane is actually going north and south on this picture, right? Basically in the middle of this picture. And 101st Avenue is going east and west towards the bottom of this picture. The shaded area that I just shaded actually represents the district's land that could be used for a future elementary school, again, if warranted. The next shaded portion is across the road of Troy Lane, and this is where the single-family homes would be located for this development. And then the final shaded area on the east side of the property, this would be where the townhomes would be constructed. So one thing to note is that the developer, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the developer and the city have done some back and forth even since ECMAC has heard about this proposal from the initial information that we had. And so the layout has changed a little bit in terms of the number of single-family homes. It's actually decreased, which does have an impact too on the enrollment that we can expect. And so this layout was just very preliminary, and it's likely already changed since ECMAC did hear this information. So a couple of important things to note related to this development. First of all, the current Fernbrook Elementary, Osseo Middle, and Maple Grove Senior areas are where students would be assigned to for attendance areas. ECMAC also looked at the potential number of students that this development may yield, specifically at our elementary level. You can see at the bottom of this slide that at the high end of the initial thinking that they're going to have 358 single-family homes and 150 townhomes, at the high end, based on trend data that we've experienced from other developments, we can expect 208 elementary students once this development is fully developed. Again, the thing to note on this that I mentioned just a moment ago is that the final numbers has actually decreased. I think it's right around 250 for single family and something less than 150 for townhomes as well. So the number that we can anticipate will be lower than that 208. And again, that average for elementary students is 155 students. So now that we've reviewed the data, as well as some of the other considerations that ECMAC looked at around 279 online, as well as the Evanswood development, I'm going to briefly review the recommendations that are coming from ECMAC based on the work that we completed this year. You can also find these recommendations in full on page 33 of your board packet. The first recommendation is to have staff continue to determine and evaluate the impact and the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on enrollment at the elementary, middle, and senior high levels. It's important that we understand if this past year that we're just coming out of was the start of a new enrollment trend for us, or if it will be seen as an outlier, again, based on the COVID-19 pandemic. The second recommendation is to have staff continue to determine and to evaluate the enrollment and capacity related impact and implications of these two other considerations, that 279 online, as well as our comprehensive, as well as that Evanswood component, which is in that third one. So the third recommendation is to have staff continue to work with the city of Maple Grove to better understand not just the amount of housing development in that Evanswood development, but also the timing. If it takes several years for that to develop, which is what they had initially talked about when they first approached the district with information, that has a different impact than if they're going to do it, over the course of a year or two. Again, specifically looking at those three schools that the attendance area would be impacted: Fernbrook Elementary, Osseo Middle, and Maple Grove Senior High. The fourth recommendation is within the framework of the Building a Better Future process to have staff identify potential options to address undercapacity conditions in schools across the district, particularly in the following schools: Crestview, Fair Oaks Elementary, and then Northview Middle School. And these three schools, as you dive into the data, were identified through that data as being the highest percentage of undercapacity in the district. The fifth recommendation is to have staff reassess the previous recommendation from ECMAC that came a year ago to address overcapacity conditions at Fernbrook Elementary, Maple Grove Senior for both classroom and cafeteria space, at Osseo Senior for cafeteria space, and at Park Center for media center space. So if you recall, ECMAC previously recommended doing building additions as part of our recommendation that came forward with the Rice Lake addition recommendation, which would address that overcapacity condition at the secondary level, both for classroom, cafeteria, as well as media center space. As part of ECMAC's previous recommendation, they also recommended the new elementary school in that Northwest Maple Grove area to address what potentially could be overcapacity conditions at the elementary level, in particular with the growth in the Northwest Maple Grove area. ECMAC is recommending an updated analysis of that work, in particular with the enrollment shifts and changes because of COVID-19 and because of the impact of the 279 online, as well as the fact that this development has started in that Northwest Maple Grove area, which could prove to be a domino effect for other developments that may spring up in that area. And then the final recommendation from ECMAC this year is that they are actually requesting information related to the impact that the broader Building a Better Future process may have on enrollment and capacity at each building in the district be brought back to them and shared to the committee when they reconvene in September of 2021. So we know, based on the other work that's happening that you're going to be hearing about later this evening, that some of the study group's work and recommendations could have an impact on the overall capacity and enrollment at particular schools. And so ECMAC, in an effort to be able to make the best informed observations and recommendations back to the superintendent and to the school board, want to make sure that they have a full picture of the other study groups and the other facility planning that's happening and how it may impact enrollment and capacity. So as we wrap up, I just want to highlight and I want to acknowledge the significant effort of our team, both the members of the community as well as our internal staff team. So as you can see here on the screen, we have over 325 collective hours that were spent in our 5 virtual meetings this year. We also had 75 collective staff planning hours, planning for and reviewing those meetings. Also, an interesting thing to note, based on the purpose of our group, which is to build community trust as it relates to enrollment capacity facility matters, the results of our year-end survey that we completed, that we asked all of our members to complete, we had 100% of our respondents share that they believe that the work of ECMAC this past year did serve to increase trust in the school district's long-term planning for our building use. So I just want to take a moment to thank our entire ECMAC team for their time, their hard work, and their commitment to our overall committee purpose, as well as to our school district as we navigated our work during this global pandemic. So we will definitely be picking up our work again in September. We will likely have some new members that will join us, that will get trained in, and we'll pick up the work and continue it into next school year. So with that, I will turn it back to Superintendent McIntyre, and I'd be happy to answer any questions board members may have.
Thank you, Ron. And I know Chair Nelson-Walton, you have kind of a routine for in virtual meetings for asking board members for questions, so I'll turn it over to you.
Who am I going to pick first? No, I'm just kidding. Let's go with Director Douglas. have any questions?
Thank you. I do not have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Grady.
Had to find the mute button. Thank you so much to the ECMAC team members for this work and analyzing the data in a way that really helps us try to figure out how to prioritize where our needs are. One of the things I was looking at in the assumptions for elementary schools is that there's no dedicated space for art for the district-wide elementary schools. And I'm wondering, since art improves test scores and graduation rates, as well as improves mental health, how do we put art space back into our schools with this assumption?
Yeah, thank you, Director Grady. That's a great question. A couple of comments that I'd make. The first is, as we go out and we look at our next generation learning spaces, which you're going to hear about in just a few moments, one of the things that we're pairing that up is also looking at our magnet programs, specifically in those buildings that hold our magnet programs. And we're having conversations about those base assumptions for our elementary school. And one of the sources of conversations that we just actually had earlier today at one of our buildings, is that art space. And so one of the great things about our base assumptions and the fact that that we have kind of created this culture of flexibility with ECMAC is that those base assumptions can and should be changing as the needs of our district shift. And so each summer we re-review those assumptions, working with our Division of Leadership and Teaching and Learning, and we may make adjustments to those in collaboration with our principals. So I will certainly take that back to our team in terms of that art space, and certainly we'll have some conversations about if that fits within the base assumption for every single one of our elementary schools, or if that's really kind of resigned for those magnet programs or those schools that have those specific art programs.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Director Simons.
Thank you for the presentation. Very well done, very concise and specific, and having the opportunity to have sat on ECMAC for since I joined the board, it's just really been a phenomenal group. It's extremely well facilitated. I have appreciated all of the opportunities that the different members have had to have their voice. And when you watch the group work, it really is quite incredible, that productive discourse and that tension of, well, this is how I would want to look at it for myself, my situation, but when I step back and I think about the entire district, I balance out the needs, it's really quite incredible how it comes together. And certainly being thrown quite the curveball with all of the work that had been done up to this point and facing the overcapacity situations, and now it really pivoting and changing potentially for the long term. It was really amazing to kind of watch everybody kind of rethink through that. So very well done. Right now, it's really just going to be, no one can predict the future. Continue to monitor and stay close to the data. So appreciate all of the hard work that went into it, and especially all of the ECMAC members for your participation and bringing forward your best thinking.
Thank you, Director Brooks.
Yes, so first, thank you to ECMAC for all of the work, particularly our parents and community members for all of your time and effort in getting this report together. I actually do have a few questions. So not being a part of ECMAC previously. So the first question I had, the enrollment percentages. So knowing that our DLA students have home schools that they would still be assigned to, or yeah, so knowing that they have home schools, do we have data that shows what those enrollment percentages would be at each of our schools, inclusive of those DLA home schools?
Yeah, thank you, Director Brooks, for that question. The enrollment data that you see in the report, the year-end summary, has all of those students that are in DLA are assigned to their buildings. So that's the total enrollment, including those DLA students. We don't have them broken out, again, because our task is really to look overall at enrollment and capacity matters. So we want to make sure that we were looking at it as if those students were coming back into the building. And obviously Online 279 is a little bit different of a scenario because that's more of a kind of a permanent program where they're choosing to do that as a regular school. So we'll look at that a little bit different next year and have that as a standalone school and then pull those out of those home schools. But for this year, because those students were still assigned to those schools, even though they were in DLA, they are counted in that enrollment as well as the projections for those schools.
And then I had a question on the analysis portion that you sort of touched on briefly at the beginning. I just wanted to know if you could maybe go into a little more detail on the qualitative and quantitative data that was used in the analysis.
So
I know that observations were a part of this. Just wanting to know, yeah, so what sort of information was pulled and incorporated into this?
Yeah, so a lot of the observations components that you'll see in the report was really kind of calling out some of the themes in terms of enrollment that had shifted from one year to another, maybe a break in trends, really calling out specific schools that were either over capacity or under capacity, and even, having questions or calling out questions in terms of the why. Again, not really in our scope of our role with ECMAC to really look into the why. But what that did is it helps to spur things like doing, and we talked about this in December, a school choice survey so that we can, as a district, better understand the why. So those are some of the kind of the quantitative data and feedback that we were getting in the observations, that even if they didn't necessarily fit within kind of our role or purpose, it still did spur on some other work for the district.
I think you actually maybe just touched on my next question. So just thinking more in terms of longer term strategic planning. Were there any discussions or analysis of the long-term impact of, let's say, the increase in charter schools within our district and what that would mean to enrollment? I know that the focus right now has been on housing development within Northwest Maple Grove, but how are we keeping track and monitoring the rise of charter schools and that being sort of a preferred choice over many of our schools?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that really goes to the heart of that school choice survey that we've talked about. So, ECMAC, those themes and those questions certainly were raised in some of the small group discussion and some of the feedback that we received. That same wondering on how does this increase in charter schools, but also some of our private schools that happened because of COVID this year, where we saw more students kind of gravitate towards some of those private schools, and what the long-term impact would be. I think that kind of came out in the recommendation as it relates to really waiting and seeing what is the long-term impact of some of those on our enrollment and capacity. So I think as a district, through some of those efforts like the school choice survey, we can hopefully better get an understanding of the why and what we maybe can expect moving forward. And that information certainly can come back to ECMAC to help them better understand why they're seeing some of the trends and some of the enrollment data that they are looking at and seeing through the data that comes to them.
Thank you. And last one, I'm going to go ahead and get this one out because I know we have a tendency to quickly move on to other topics, and I don't know when we'll revisit it. But just for those schools that are significantly under capacity right now, this may be more of a Superintendent McIntyre question, just wondering how we are capitalizing on the lower capacities and making the most out of it. Is it actually reflecting lower class sizes, and have we seen progress in student achievement?
Ron, do you want to try that first, or I can jump right in? Maybe this has been a part of your conversation at ACMAC as well.
Yeah, I can certainly speak a little bit in terms of how some of those spaces are being used, because even as we're going out and doing these site visits as it relates to building a better future, we're seeing some of the creative things. I'll say that COVID has certainly changed some of the things that we're able to do this year. So we want to try to separate that, but certainly schools are able to use some of that capacity in creative ways. Some of them are lowering class sizes. Some of them are using them for additional collaboration spaces or flex spaces. Some of them are using them for spaces for students to go and to exercise and get active throughout the day, which can help for them to be able to focus better in the classroom. And so there's a wide variety of ways that those principals are using those spaces, even if not for classroom space, but certainly spaces that students can utilize throughout the day that can help them in their learning. In terms of achievement, I don't know, Superintendent McIntyre, if you want to.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great one, and we wish we had a better answer. It's hard to draw a causal relationship there, where there's some correlational things we think matter, especially with that description Ron gave about small groups, maybe a little bit more individualized attention, individualized support. Even if class sizes are similar to other buildings, having multiple spaces where you can break out and provide individual support and attention really, we believe makes a big difference in the learning, especially when we're in person. Now this year we had a lot of time out of the building, and being back now in rhythm with the end of the year with being full in person, those spaces really become important to us as we re-engage students and work hard to address some of the gaps that we're identifying. So I think Ron's assessment really captured it well. We generally stick to our class size targets across our district, but then maximize the spaces for individualized support.
Thank you. Thank you both.
All right, Director Mosqueda Jones.
Having been to just 2 ECMAC meetings, I am impressed at the level of engagement, and I want to thank all the people that are on ECMAC, especially the community members, for the hard work and attention to detail. My question is, are we thinking about possibly, as this has become a theme for this particular board, including students in this process? I think that their perspective would be helpful, and it would also allow for opportunities for students to have some community engagement that they might not be able to have in other venues.
I think, thank you, Director Mosqueda Jones. I do appreciate that feedback, and certainly take that back to our planning team, because I think that's a great idea to try to figure out how we can integrate our students. I think that's a great idea.
Well, yeah, I would just want to say thank you. I mean, the energy is always seems to be there with ECMAC, and I think you have such a great representation of our district. And I feel like, ECMAC is like kind of that, it raises a lot of emotions, when we start to talk about a lot of these particular issues and the over and under capacity. I mean, people really pay attention. I mean, that's when I think people really do pay attention to see what's going on. So I do appreciate just the thoughtfulness that goes into that, to this whole process. And, Dr. Simons and I, have always kind of brought up when we were sitting on the Building Better Futures around, if we're gonna be one district and say we are, and that's our goal, right? That's what we believe. And so while we were looking at overcapacity, to also address undercapacity and really maximize all of the great things that are happening on our district. And it's so important to have both. So I appreciate the just calling out which schools have the highest percentage of undercapacity, as Thomas alluded to. And, I'm really curious. I know the recommendation is to explore options. Have there been options explored at this point?
Thank you, Chair Dawson-Walton. And we're going to touch on this a little bit in our next presentation. But, part of the challenge is we want to make sure that as we're looking at undercapacity, that we're doing it from kind of a district-wide strategic approach. And so we have several different study areas that we're working through right now that you're going to hear about in just a moment. And I think it's important that we have a real understanding of what our space needs are before we start looking at how do we address undercapacity. And I think it's also important to note, to Director Brooks's point, that we do have buildings that might be on one of these charts as undercapacity, and yet they're using their spaces in very creative ways to benefit kids. So we have to, kind of balance that as well in our planning. So we are still working through those study groups. It is definitely on our radar to look at options to address undercapacity, but we think we need to make sure that we're unearthing all the facility needs first before we start looking at that undercapacity and what some of the creative ways that we can use that capacity.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Director Mosqueda Jones, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I was.
Or you were like just saying hi?
Hi. I would like to see some of that qualitative data on how buildings are using their spaces. I think we can sometimes get caught up in those numbers and go, wow, they must have a lot of empty rooms sitting there. And speaking as a teacher, we use every space that we possibly can. So just kind of how we're using it, how people are, figuring it out. I'm not saying let's not do something with that space, but let's be very intentional when we're doing that.
Thank you. Director Simons and then Director Grady.
Sorry, I was just going to add on, Jackie. So one thing we did not have the opportunity to do because of COVID was do the site visits and tours. So typically that's part of the work over the course of the year. So we have the opportunity to go actually see the spaces and have some of those conversations and really understand what's happening at the sites and how they're utilizing their space. So that helps round out the full picture. Typically, just this is a bit of an odd year.
What are the facilities needs for the online school? I mean, I know in some ways it'll reduce the amount of space we need, but teachers and administrators still need space. So how is that being addressed?
Yeah, thank you, Director Grady. And I'm actually going to invite Executive Director of Technology, Anthony Paternos, to speak to it a little bit as well. But we have started to have some of those initial conversations about the space needs for our staff, both for kind of some office spaces, but also for things like labs and different things like that. So Anthony, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to some of the specifics of that.
Yeah, we are still processing through that. Michael Lehan, myself, and Kristen Hauge had met with Ron and Dale to go through a laundry list of wishes for spaces. So we are still working through that with the idea that we will have some staff, counseling staff, admin staff, clerical staff that will be working at a physical workspace on site. And then looking at for our teaching staff who will primarily be working remotely, but where are those spaces and opportunities when we can bring them in collaboratively? As Ron mentioned, thinking through what does a potential model or demo classroom look like. So if we have a science teacher who wants to come in and do a lab setting to be able to virtually show that lab setting, where can we find a space to potentially carve out for that, as well as, if we have IEPs or particular in-person interventions we want to administer, where could we find some potential spaces for that, which, some of the conversation has actually led to, as we, talk about some of those buildings that are looking at undercapacity, do they potentially have a room that could be utilized by 279 online staff or the team in order to engage students and families in a different and creative way. So we're working through that with a good laundry list of items to process through still.
Yeah, Anthony, you hit on most of them, and the only other pieces that I would even add is just the notion of testing, right? MCA, where are we going to provide those MCA testing experiences? So we think about under capacity, that's a really great leverage point. We also, throughout the staffing experience, had hubs that will use some of our sites to disperse some materials for 279 online as well. So there's some things that we're still, as alluded to, we're still kind of working through in that regard.
Well, thank you, and we're looking forward to the next presentation because I think that all kind of comes together and builds off of each other. So I'll hand it back over to you, Superintendent McIntyre.
Thank you, board members, for your great questions. And I do want to also echo my kind of echo your sentiments around the great work that ECMAC did this year under challenging circumstances. Still found a way to kind of persevere, and I love the approach of really analyzing the information as it's coming in. I think Director Simons, you said it well. It's hard to predict the future, but we're sure using a lot of data to try to narrow the breadth of that down and try to come up with some predictable ways, at least try to come up with some predictable ways. And I know Ron said we'll keep watching that, but that really means what Director Simon says, monitor and evaluate on a continual basis, right? Knowing that conditions have changed. And, you know, we're just kind of waiting to see how this, how things settle down, how things settle back into our use of physical locations in our building. We were out of them for so many months of the year. So again, just my gratitude to the entire team, and looks like they get to take a little break over the summer before coming back at it hard in September. So unless we call them back early, right, Ron? Okay, well, thank you. We're going to transition to another update for you on building a better future and following up on the recommendations that were made to the board last spring, May, and actually in June when they were approved, and specifically around study groups. And as Anthony's pulling up the presentation here, I'll just mention, you know, when we started the school year, a lot of the study groups were not able to meet early on in the fall, and then we were able to, as we were working through all the challenges with the pandemic and COVID, we're able to get some traction and movement and get some things started here in the beginning of the year in January. So we're going to give you an update on what we've been able to accomplish up to that point. And please just remember, it's kind of a progress monitoring report. Really, the work is not done, but it was a good point to check in with you on what we've been able to accomplish and what is out in front of us. So on the next slide is just a bit of really an overview of what we're hoping for you to get from the presentation tonight, and give you an update on the study groups, each of the study groups, and then really give board members an understanding of the district's updated phase approach to our comprehensive facility plan and where we think we need to go from here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ron. You know, board members, you had a couple meetings off from Ron, and now you're getting a large dose of Ron on facilities again. So thank you, Rod, for taking it over here, and then you'll turn over to the rest of the team.
Okay, thank you. So before we dive into each of the different study areas, I just want to take a few moments to review with the board and our community how we got to our current reality with these study groups. So on the screen in front of you is a timeline of the important events that has transpired over the past 2.5 years in our comprehensive facility planning process. So as you see on the top left-hand side of the screen, in the fall of 2018, ECMAC began their third year of work by reviewing options to address overcapacity conditions at the elementary level in particular. So some of the discussions during that time centered around building additions, potentially a new elementary school, and or boundary changes. And at the same time that work was happening, the district leadership team was also having some internal conversations around facility needs in several other areas. And this ultimately resulted in a pause of ECMAC's work that year in an effort to create a comprehensive integrated facility plan. And so you'll see that on the bottom left-hand side. And this work occurred for really most of 2019. It included advisory teams that looked at facility needs for next generation learning spaces, both at the elementary and the secondary levels, looked at safety and security facility needs, enrollment and capacity facility needs through ECMAC, and also athletic facility needs. And then on January 14th of last year, of 2020, the school board heard the results of those study teams, and you'll see that in that third element of the timeline. Below that, on the fourth element of the timeline, all of those facility recommendations were then, after that school board work session, were then forwarded to an oversight task force. Their job was to prioritize the recommendations. And you'll see that, their responsibility was to take all of those recommendations and to prioritize them, and also to identify funding sources. And then ultimately, after all of that work, to make a comprehensive facility recommendation back to the superintendent. From there, then, if you move back up to the fifth timeline element, you'll see that the superintendent recommended board action on the plan that was recommended. And then the sixth timeline element, which occurred on June 23rd, again, virtually of last year, the board actually approved the superintendent's recommendation. These recommendations included the addition at Rice Lake Elementary School to address overcapacity conditions at the elementary level. It also included LTFM projects to replace things like turf fields, scoreboards, track resurfacing, and many other athletic facilities. And it also recommended creating study groups that would then dig further into facility needs in specific areas. This included next generation learning space audits, community education facility needs, student service facility needs, magnet school programming facility needs, career tech ed facility needs, next generation furniture standards, and then also, as we talked just a few moments ago, options to address undercapacity facilities. And then the final element to the superintendent recommendation was that the oversight task force that had brought forth the initial recommendation on a comprehensive facility plan would then reconvene after those study groups were done to continue their work on prioritizing those facility recommendations, identifying funding sources, and coming back then with a final comprehensive recommendation. Then you'll see up on timeline element number 7 that the Rice Lake addition work is moving along as planned. So we started back last June, essentially right after the school board approved that addition and those recommendations. And we still are anticipating completion of that project in January of 2022, so next January. While the study group that I just mentioned, why all of those study groups that I mentioned were scheduled to begin last August and September, you see in timeline element number 8 that because of our district's response to COVID-19 and just the amount of time and energy that went into to preparing and then kind of moving back and forth between different models, the work of these study groups was delayed, and we really weren't able to pick it up until December of 2020. And since that time, our work groups have been hard at work. So tonight, as Superintendent McIntyre mentioned, it's our opportunity to, for each of our groups to update the board on our progress. So Anthony, you can go to the next slide. So with that, the first study group that we're going to look at is our next generation learning space audit. This study group's work is based on the recommendations that came from our next generation learning space facility needs work group that happened actually in the fall of 2019. These were the recommendations that came to the board in January of 2020, so a little over a year and a half ago. And while the desired elements of next generation learning spaces was identified by that group, there was still a need to evaluate each of our buildings to understand the current reality related to those elements that were recommended. So with that, the purpose of this study group is to meet at each of our sites in our district, along with our building principals, to understand how the elementary and secondary next generation learning space recommendations, how they currently exist, and then also identify any potential gaps. So you can see that the members of this small group include myself, as well as Assistant Superintendent Steve Flisk for our elementary sites, Assistant Superintendent Kelly Parpart for our secondary sites, our Director of Facilities, Dale Carlstrom, as well as representatives from Wold Architects and Engineers. Because we are visiting each site in the system, we have and will continue to meet many times to complete our work. And you can see a list of meeting dates really that goes through last week, but even this week we've had a couple of days where we've been out at sites already, and so we have many more scheduled over the next several weeks. Next slide, Anthony. So to just take a quick look at the progress of our work, the first step of our work was to develop a matrix by which we can evaluate each of our buildings as to their alignment with that original study group's recommendations. And as we started to get into creating that matrix, really in January, we realized that that we're missing some information, and we needed some additional information specific to our media center space at each the elementary and the secondary level. So we brought together several different groups to get feedback. We met with or had meetings with our tech ESPs. We got feedback from our library media specialists. And then we brought together the original work group from both the elementary and the secondary next generation learning space teams to both inform and then also to gain some consensus on what that set of criteria should look like for each of our media centers in our district. Once that was established and we were able to land on consensus for our media centers, we were able to create a rubrics for scoring for each of our buildings based on their alignment with the recommendations and the key points from the original study group. Then the current work is that now that we're going out to each of the individual buildings, we're meeting with that building leader as well as team members that principal may invite to the conversation. Specifically, we've had several people from the media centers that have joined the conversations. And then we're filling out that rubric and scoring that rubric, which ultimately we hope will help us to determine the gap areas, and hopefully we'll start to see some themes emerge, and we already have at the elementary level. Next slide, Anthony. So in terms of next steps, we're going to continue and ultimately finalize our elementary school walkthroughs, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And then we'll shift our attention to our secondary schools. You're going to hear a little bit later in the presentation some of the work of our Career and Tech Ed study group. And so our plan is to do our next generation learning space walkthroughs in coordination and alignment with our CTE group to be as efficient with our time as and more importantly with our building principal and building leadership teams as possible, so we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. And once all of the walkthroughs are completed, we will then compile the data. We're going to look for trends that may appear across all of our buildings. And then ultimately, we'll create a report that will identify those gap areas that exist in our buildings that really prevent us from having alignment with those recommendations that came from that original Next Generation Learning Space Study team. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian Severson Hall, who's going to walk us through the next study group.
All right, thanks, Ron. Good evening, everybody. You can go to the next slide, thanks. So this particular study group around community ed looked at determining space needs for really two things: community use of facilities, since community ed oversees the procedures on that, as well as taking a tighter look at our community education program use of facilities. The team was comprised of myself, Carrie Cade, our leadership team, and all the other people who do programming for community ed. We did some of our work through survey since we weren't officing all together anymore. And then we used our March coordinator leadership meeting to dig deeper into this. You can move forward, Anthony. You can see 3 of the things that we did were agreeing upon most requested space needs for community ed programs. So some of the stuff we needed to summarize a little bit because each program likes to dig deep in their particular area. So we talked about where we had some commonalities on requested space needs, discovered areas where we have specific programmatic space and access needs. So not every site plays out the same for when you look at expanded programs through community ed. And then we also broke down requests by program area and examined where those intersect or conflict with each other at times. So believe it or not, we sometimes have conflicts with within our own department on utilizing space. So that was an interesting part of the meeting where you get to go through your conflicts with each other, right? So that was a part of this meeting. So you can move on, Anthony. I wanted to highlight a couple of program areas because I think that might be of interest to this group. Our ECFE, some additional space, particularly needed on the east side of the district. We obviously have a robust Arbor View location on the west side, which is nice. And at Willow Lane, Willow Lane is a multi-program use building, so you can see some Y space needs come up there. ECFE, as most of you know, obviously we're serving our youngest learners, but we're also doing parenting classes and screening. So there's adults in those spaces as well. And then some access to shared spaces, right-sized playgrounds, small and large motor rooms, etc. And of course, right-sized restrooms is important when you're working with your youngest learners. And I think the district has done a pretty good job already of addressing some of this last part, but as we've expanded some of our pre-K programming, we've made some adjustments at elementary sites, but that still comes up on when we're looking to expand the work. Adult Basic Ed, they're primarily located at the Northwest Family Service Center. They would like to see some expansion of large group spaces for speakers, and then especially our evening classes. One of the things I'll touch upon toward the end is time of day is also probably talked about a little bit more in this group than some of the other groups that study space, because programming takes place all day, afternoon, evening, and sometimes in the weekend. Fortunately, the ABE program continues to be popular. Would love to see 3 to 5 more classrooms, as well as office space and dedicated space at Willow Lane for expansion. Then we're going to move on to facilities. And facilities, this is around community use of school facilities. So some additional space for community use and rentals. Depending on the time of year, stages or auditoriums can be high need. Like springtime's a perfect example, not this year, but for dance studios, a lot of performances. So you see an increase in that type of request this time of year. And then as you go into summer, you see an increase of sometimes stadium use. We're actually seeing a new phenomenon this spring, which is some requests for field space, which hasn't really been a typical thing. So I'm not quite sure what that all is about. But gyms, classrooms, a full building to schedule. So kind of in your brain, think of like a community center. What would something like that look like? And then potential expansion at the ESC on weekends, whether that's for staff development options or other community options. Then enrichment, greater access to space for enrichment class offerings, classrooms, specialty rooms, I think art classes, cooking classes, things like that. And again, you see another theme here, a building that could be programmed out of all day. That's where you kind of use multi-use spaces for fitness studios, kitchens, artist spaces, not just nights and weekends. And then our last program that we want to highlight is Kids Stop 4-Star. Dedicated space of at least one full classroom for each Kid Stop program site and each 4-star program at sites. Potential additional or added classroom spaces. We've named 3 of our schools where if we had an additional classroom space, we would fill that with an additional 4-star class, for example. So those 3 sites in particular, they have waiting lists for 4-star that would run an entire additional 4-star program if they actually had the space. And then again, specialized spaces, storage, office spaces, and additional classroom space for check-in, so that not everything's happening in the cafeteria, for example, checking in, snack, etc. So that's like a little snapshot of what was highlighted in different program areas. And then I would say next steps, collaborate with other groups that are meeting. Clearly, I think you can see the connection between the ECMAC presentation and the Next Gen Learning Space presentation that you just heard. All those things need to collaborate with one another. I do think one thing that we didn't surface deep enough yet in our work, but will continue to surface, is what I mentioned earlier, which is around time of day. These are some generalizations. Early childhood, what time of day do they want to access spaces more? The morning, based on the age group that they work with. What time are Kids Stop and enrichment? They're all out of school time programs. So they're really looking at that 2 to 6 window. And then, of course, some of our programs like adult enrichment, ABE, and some ECFE adult classes and community use of school facilities are nights, are evenings and weekends. So I think as we do next steps, we'll look at a little more, we'll give you some more time snapshots that I think will be important versus just programmatic snapshots. And again, potential things to explore, the early learning spaces, community input, and then buildings or large pockets of spaces that might be completely dedicated to CE programming, because then you would move different programs in throughout those spaces based on the time of day. So that's as good of a snapshot as I can give you for the work we've currently done, and we'll look forward to having more conversations in the future. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I had the opportunity to facilitate, or I have the opportunity to facilitate student services facility needs. Primarily what we're looking at is student services, talented and gifted programming, and then emerging English learners. You'll see here that the purpose is just to, as mentioned, is to explore what are our facility needs for each site and determine space and facilities to accommodate the programming that we desire. You'll see that we have a small team as far as the core members, but also you'll see that at the bottom that we've had a lot of sub teams as well who have engaged a lot of their peers and their colleagues to ensure that we have a great cross-section of voices that are engaged in the process. You'll also see that we have the meeting dates, and we also know that the meeting dates have had, there's some other ones that are not mentioned that have been facilitated by the core group members. Next slide, please, Anthony. One of the things that we wanted to do before we got into this work is that we wanted to begin to look inward. You know, what are our mental models around student services, talented and gifted, and so forth? What are our mental models? So we took some time to look inward, and then we took some time to look around, right? What is our current existing space around our system and then some of our peers? And so what is our current state, and then what is our equitable state? Now, our equitable state, that is looking forward, right? To make sure that we are crossing the T's and dotting the I's, so to speak, to make sure that as we think about our equity-oriented strategic plan and we think about programming and the opportunities that we're providing, that we're making sure that we are synthesizing the information through a critical race lens to make sure that we are providing equitable opportunities for our scholars. So what does that look like? So what we did was spend some time doing program sharing as we talk about student services. That is a broad swath of whether it be nursing stations, whether it be our center-based programming, whatever the case might be. And again, you'll see a lot of intersectionality between not only my work group, but each of the other work groups as we think about a comprehensive model for our system. And then we wanted to review what our current reality is. What is the proximity as we think about interventions for special ed specifically? If I have 15 minutes with a social worker, but my transition time takes 5 minutes to walk to and from, I'm only getting 10 minutes of that service provided. Same thing as we think about talented and gifted programming. And that's in many spaces is a pull-out model. Rather, it should be a push-in model. And what might that look like? And that's the mental models and philosophy that we need to begin to unpack. And as I spoke about that, that's really just engaging the stakeholders. As I mentioned, the core members of the team engaged some of our colleagues about what is the current reality through their lens. What is our model reality? Do we see some programming that is something that we'd want to replicate or borrow from, whether it be in district, that's classrooms, in system, that say, wow, this is really comprehensive experience that we want to model after. And then if we don't identify that, or if there's opportunities for growth, that's when we begin to look at what our desired reality is. What is best practice and what provides our scholars the best opportunity to leverage their inherent brilliance. And then best practice recommendations. That's something that with the study groups that we have done to bring forward some of the best practice recommendations. Next slide, please, Anthony. So as we look forward, and I guess I would be remiss, as we think about EL specifically, one of the things that we talked about was kind of flexible furniture. Interestingly enough, we know that some of our 1s and 2s are kind of a center-based experience. So how can we have larger classrooms so we can have some flexible spacings, flex grouping inside of there, and sound panels to make sure that it doesn't get so loud. So if I'm trying to understand a language that's not my home language and the noise is deafening, so to speak, my language acquisition is probably not going to be as high as what it could be. As I mentioned earlier, the TAG, talented and gifted. So I think a talented and giftedness, service for all, service for some, and then service for few. But we know again that our scholars here in Osceola area schools are brilliant. So how do we do a push-in model to classrooms to ensure that our talented and gifted is something, as we think about equitable practice, that's something that we're seeing in some of our neighboring districts is a push-in model for talented and gifted programming. And then as we think about student services, the resource rooms or center-based rooms specifically, space sometimes can be an issue, and then sometimes they're shared spaces as well. So what type of spaces do we need to develop and offer? So as we think about life skills and functional skills for our young people, how are our spaces allowing their opportunities to grow and transition into adulthood in some of those spaces? We will continue to engage our colleagues. It's our other colleagues on the Building the Better Future. There's a natural intersection there. We've already received some scholar voice specifically, and we're going to get some more staff voice to understand our current context. And then we're going to really hone in. I like the idea that we heard earlier about a rubric from the colleagues here. We're going to continue to gather that and figure out how are we going to begin to analyze this information, and then continue to explore standards of excellence, right? What is our model that we want to be, a model district, a destination district? And so how our programmings in the area of student services, special ed, talented and gifted, and our EL, how does that look? Because we often know that all students benefit from an education that provides strength-based, culturally relevant enrichment. Each student has untapped brilliance. We know that to be true, and that that can be fostered through gifted and responsive education. And ultimately, that's our goal. At this time, I'll pass it over to Dr. Flisk for the next group.
Sorry, thank you. Anthony, you can go ahead and advance, please. So, good evening, everyone. Here to provide a brief update on the work that the Magnet Study Group has begun over the last several months. As you can see here, the purpose of the group is to evaluate opportunities for current and potential future magnet school programming, including a STEAM high school as part of CETA, which I'll explain. This will require the group to determine really space and facility needs to accommodate current and future magnet school programming. So again, we have a cross-section of participants that include our elementary and secondary magnet principals, obviously the assistant superintendents. We have Department of Educational Equity and Learning and Achievement. So we have a nice, good complement. The full magnet group has now met a total of 6 times, beginning in March. So we delayed in order to really allow both elementary and secondary leaders to transition students and staff back into full in-person. So I do want to thank each of our school and district leaders as they have been balancing this work with demanding schedules. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned, one of the key pieces that we have done in January, or excuse me, in February, was discuss the CETA proposal. And so a little background on that. So a small subgroup of us participated in a meeting with the Center, meeting on the Center for Innovation and the Arts, CETA, at the end of February. And so Jay Strobel, who's the Brooklyn Park City Manager, as well as Dr. Rolando Garcia, presented their vision. So CETA is a partnership project that includes North Hennepin Community College, Hennepin County, the City of Brooklyn Park, and others. The partners are proposing to locate the center on the northeast corner of 85th Avenue North and West Broadway, adjacent to the Hennepin County Brooklyn Park Library and across from the campus. So their vision is to create a flexible facility that increases educational opportunities for students, increases economic prosperity, and advances the quality of life in Brooklyn Park and surrounding communities. And a portion of the CETA discussion was the possibility of a STEAM high school connected to the campus, the library, to really help, in part, alleviate potential overcrowding at Osseo area senior high schools. And that was part of an interest that goes back several years. At this time, the Magnet Study Group focuses really on exploring the possibilities in our current facilities for meeting those current or future magnet needs, but we certainly see some opportunities. So the group has not made a formal recommendation regarding a STEAM high school, but are certainly open and excited to learn more about what potentially is coming with the CETA. The main aspect of what we have been working on is really reviewing the Magnet Schools of America evaluation and recommendations that we received back in June of 2019. So just some background on that. Osseo contracted with the Magnet Schools of America to conduct this review of our magnet schools, which included a document review, some site visits, interviews, and focus groups. And so the board heard the findings in October of 2019. And so I've attached the full report if you're interested in seeing more of that detail. So back in January of 2020, the magnet school principals actually began that process of reviewing the studies and findings. But of course, later we were suspended, the work was suspended due to the pandemic. So now, as I've mentioned, we have a new study group that's come together with additional stakeholders as part of the Building a Better Future Magnet Programming Study Group. And so we did use the Magnet School Principals past work as a starting point. And so the studies group has spent some time reviewing the MSA report to identify current needs and potential future magnet program priorities. So this analysis, we believe, will allow the group to prioritize and make recommendations for facility and space needs once there's consensus. And our group has made some progress in identifying potential priorities and some possible actions that for implementation in our schools, as well as for the district at the district level. Next slide, please. So as we could see here, we have some work to do. We need to, work remains in identifying these priorities, as I had mentioned, for our magnet schools, discussing potential theme possibilities and enhancement, and identifying improvements in our current magnet programs, along with considering what are the future space and facility needs that we anticipate. And of course, I think as with the other groups, we're going to likely require some involvement of some additional stakeholders who are going to need to provide some feedback. And so finally, to date, we have visited 2 of the 6 magnet schools as part of the next generation walkthroughs that Ron mentioned. And so We've begun to incorporate additional questions and gathering some information regarding current program facility needs. So of course, much more work needs to be done, but I believe we've had a good start. And so as Ron mentioned, in these site visits, we've seen some incredible and exciting things happening. For instance, today we had a chance to see the outdoor classrooms at Zanewood and see how they're, how innovative that team is using space. So we're excited to learn more from each of the schools over the coming months and really figure out how we can support what they're doing and how we can grow the programs into the future. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Kelly Parpart.
Kelly, you're muted.
Yeah, Kelly, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Here I was going on introducing everything and nobody could even hear me. Okay, I'm sorry, everybody. All I was saying was good evening, and I'm so excited to be here to talk about the career and tech ed programming. And here I was telling Anthony to advance the slide, and nobody could even hear me. So the purpose of our group is to determine District 279 character and tech ed programming for each of our comprehensive high schools, as well as the OALC, and then to determine the space and the facility needs to accommodate that programming. So the members of our group are the 3 comprehensive high school principals, the OALC principal, our CTE coordinator, senior leadership from the Department of Leadership or Learning and Achievement, and then Kim Riesgraff, who is an educational consultant, along with myself. And our group began meeting the week that we returned from winter break. And we have met every week since winter break. By the end of May, we will have met 20 times for 2 hours each time. And I told Ron, I loved his collective hours of learning and working. So I asked him if I could borrow it. And so this group, by the end of May, will have met over 360 hours collectively. So there's been a lot of work, good work that's been done. Thank you, Anthony. So the key updates, we reviewed our 10-year employment forecast, which was really important. So we looked at the 10-year employment forecast, and then we took that in correlation with the Minnesota Career Wheel to look at what is the trend data telling us that our students need to be ready for the workforce in the next 10 years. We reviewed the career and tech ed programs of study. We also looked at national and other district and local CTE programs. And then we evaluated student interest because we knew that that was a very important piece of our work. So we looked at historical trend data for students around CTE programming. So an example of that would be registration trend data. So for example, what CTE courses had our students tallied for over the years? Which were the courses that they were expressing the most interest in? Which were the courses that were growing? And then we also looked at student groups. So what were some of the student groups that students were requesting that the principals consider implementing in the schools? So one that jumps to mind right away is robotics. So that is a student group that has a high degree of student interest. We also had principals meet regularly with the building and the site CTE staff so that they could keep them apprised of our work, and more importantly, so that they could get feedback about our work. So those meetings were to have occurred weekly. Every time we met, the principals were to go back and meet with their CTE staff. There were too many CTE staff in all of our buildings in order to bring us together in one collective group. So we had the principals serve as that liaison to be sure to get the feedback and the necessary perspectives that we needed. Thank you, Anthony. So continuing our progress of work to date, there were 2 specialty strands that were identified for each comprehensive high school. And it's really important to understand that these programs are housed at these schools. These are not the school programs. The programs are housed at the buildings, but they're district programs. So we were very intentional and very specific about offering a variety of programming. You can see that there's 6 different strands that we're offering, so that we didn't just offer the same 2 strands in every single building, because that wouldn't be offering the opportunities that we wanted to be able to offer for our students in CTE programming. So we were very intentional about offering different strands at every single school, but those strands are housed at those schools and they are available for every district student. And a big part of our work was meeting with other groups, such as transportation, for example. So meeting with transportation to be sure that we had transportation that we would be able to provide for our students so that they could attend any of those programs in any of the schools, and that they didn't have to rely on their own transportation, that we would make sure and provide that for them. So there are 6 distinctly different strands, and that was very intentional, again, to give variety to all of our high school students in their programming. So Maple Grove Senior High is business, finance, and marketing, and engineering technology. Those will be the 2 strands that any students can access. The 2 strands at Osseo Senior High are automotive services and health careers. Those are 2 very well established strands at Osseo Senior High, and kids already are going to those programs from from both Maple Grove Senior High and from Park Center Senior High. And then at Park Center Senior High, construction management is a really growing strand that students are showing a lot of interest around. And then of course they have an extremely strong culinary foods program for restaurant and food service management. And we have many students that are already competing in the Minnesota statewide culinary foods competition that's held every year. The Osseo Area Learning Center will continue with their early and middle college program, but as well, any of the ALC students are also able to be transported back and forth to any of our programs. We also identified challenges and implications to these proposed strands, and then we engaged both district and industry experts in helping us address those challenges. Okay, Anthony. So the next steps then for our study group are really to continue to deepen and further outline our program of study for each of the CTE specialty strands, and really to continue to strengthen the certifications connected with each strand, as well as the articulation agreements and concurrent enrollment options. And one of the documents that was attached to your board packet was a report. And in that report, you can see the certifications and articulation agreements and concurrent enrollment that is called out for each strand. So what we're doing now is continuing to build on that and continue to add to that. We will also continue to partner with the groups that you see on the screen. Those are the experts, which I referenced earlier, as we continue to surface questions. And then we will complete site visits at each building. We will do those in collaboration with Wold Architects, as well as with our facilities and transportation operations staff, so that we can begin to identify what of our existing facilities meet our CTE future programming needs, and then identify if there's any gaps and how we address those. So I will now turn it over to Ron.
Okay, thank you. One of the recommendations that came from both our elementary and our secondary next generation study groups that met in 2019 was to implement a flexible furniture standard for learning spaces that would also include student choice. So with that, the purpose of the furniture standard study group is to build a foundation for the school district's commitments and expectations that will guide the implementation of a flexible furniture program to support next generation learning. As you see here on the slide, we have quite a large group that includes members of our purchasing team, Principals at each level, our assistant superintendents and other Division of Leadership, Teaching, and Learning staff, staff from our Department of Educational Equity, staff from our Facilities Department, as well as WOLD architects and engineers. Thus far, we have had 2 meetings, and we also anticipate having 1 additional meeting. We're hoping to wrap up our work after 1 more additional meeting that should take place in the next 2 weeks. The work that this group engaged in started with a review of the furniture recommendations that came from that Next Generation Learning Space study team, as well as the media center criteria that was established during the facility audit study team that we discussed a little bit earlier in the presentation. We then had some great small group discussions around value statements related to furniture. Really looking at furniture as a support for student learning. And then finally, our work has really centered around creating some draft commitment statements through those small groups that can accurately communicate what we believe as a school district and how and what we value related to furniture in our buildings and to support next generation learning. Next slide. So our goal, as we mentioned, is to gain consensus on a set of commitments to propose for district adoption related to flexible furniture. So once we are able to land on that set of commitments, we will then develop a recommendation report related to those commitments. And essentially what this will help us do is to guide our purchasing of furniture, as well as to make sure that in each of our schools in our buildings that we're utilizing furniture to support student learning, whether it be in the classroom, whether it be in open flex spaces, whether it be in the lunchrooms or in the media center, really any place in our buildings that we believe can be learning spaces. We want to make sure that we are utilizing that furniture to support that student learning, that really highlights student choice and highlights flexibility for our students. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Superintendent Mike McIntyre to look at the next steps of our work.
All right, thank you, Ron, and thank you, members of our team, board members. As you can see, a lot of work has happened here, especially since December, picking up where we left off with the board action last June. So moving forward, I just want to take a moment to emphasize once again, as you hear all this information tonight, it's just a monitoring report for you tonight. The work's not done. You heard many in each of the study groups kind of forecasting what needs to come next in their work, but that was important for you to get a sense for where we're at in the process. Once we're finished, once each of the study groups are finished and have developed their recommendations, they will give those to that oversight task force that Ron talked about earlier. And that oversight task force will take the time they need to do 2 things: prioritize those recommendations from the study groups, and then also find funding solutions for those recommendations as they're prioritized, and make really some comprehensive facility recommendations back to me as superintendent that could include a potential bond referendum to fund those recommendations. So as you've heard from Ron earlier, what really is needed here is time to continue the work, time to really determine the impact on enrollment from COVID, from 279 online, and really that monitoring that pace of growth and development in Northwest Maple Grove that we're beginning to see. So those variables, as mentioned earlier, really do continue to make things a bit uncertain, as we don't know exactly what that impact is, as hard as we are, really analyzing the data, as you saw with ECMAC, to project enrollment capacity in the district. So I do want to take a moment just to point out, it was kind of mentioned earlier, one of those study groups was that undercapacity study group, and that group has not yet convened because we need to be further along in the work and understanding of our capacity needs through these study groups to be able to give them information to work with and develop strategic options to address the undercapacity challenges. So once we have those recommendations, that's going to be the information and data that will really give that undercapacity study group a chance to dig in and develop those recommendations. So the administrative team will begin to put together some of those the undercapacity options in the coming months, and that'll go to ECMAC for consideration. Next slide, Anthony. So some key considerations, just to try to hone in on some themes here. As Ron mentioned earlier, we need some more time and do the delayed start due to COVID. And even with that delayed, I'm still proud of the work that has been able to get done since December and January, just to move this along as fast as we can, knowing that we've had a lot of other demands throughout the winter and spring as we're getting to now the end of the school year due to the pandemic. And you can see as things have shifted and stabilized with the pandemic and our learning models, an increased rigor around these committees' efforts and frequency of their ability to meet and really begin to develop their work. So we know from many of those study groups, it was first establishing what our vision is from a teaching and learning and programmatic perspective, and really needing to get to a spot where those concepts and principles are really set to drive our facilities planning and response. We've heard tonight too that the recommendation from ECMAC is to continue to study those enrollment trends based on the impact of COVID and the growth trends that we're continually evaluating. So trying to figure out what this past year is, as Ron said so well in the beginning, whether it's an anomaly or whether it's a new trend, we're going to learn as we go. But we're still in the midst of strategic planning as well. So as we get specifically through our ECAP and equity-oriented strategic planning process, which is nearing completion, our facility plan will need to support the implementation of that strategic plan once it's determined. And we really are being deliberate about that work not being done ahead of the strategic plan, but letting that plan drive the completion of our work that you heard about tonight. And anytime we think about it, asking our community to entrust us with their resources, we really need to articulate the need and the why in a compelling way. And right now, we just need more time to clearly identify and clearly articulate what those needs are, so we can be very transparent about what the why is for all these areas that we're evaluating. So on the next slide is really kind of an updated phased approach. And my recommendation is to kind of update our approach from what you heard last May and June, based really on the experiences we've had since then and what we learned since then with so many changes coming at us. I really do recommend keeping our focus on the renewal of the operating and tech levies. And at the same time, while we're doing that, continue to evaluate and get more clarity and build that comprehensive and compelling case for a bond referendum to meet the needs of our facilities plan. So with that in mind, kind of from a timeline perspective, how that would look is go to the voters for an operating and capital projects levies renewal in November of 2022. Then by the next fall, it gives us basically another year to finish the work you've heard about tonight and have a better understanding of what our enrollment needs are. And then in the fall of November of 2023, come back to the voters for a potential bond referendum. We may determine that's not needed, but really looking at that year to determine a potential bond referendum to meet the needs from the study groups and the oversight task force that once they do their work, come back with recommendations on how to fund that. So again, one of those funding mechanisms might be a referendum. So in conclusion, through the update, I know it's been a lot of information, but I really wanted you to have a perspective and an update of all the work that's been happening related to the approval you made last June. The work's still in progress, it's not done, and there's more to do. And the teams are going to continue to meet, continue to develop their recommendations, eventually hand those to our oversight task force, who will prioritize and find funding mechanisms for those recommendations. And along the way, we will work hard to keep you informed and our community informed of our progress as we continue to move through all those steps. So with that, Chair Dawson Walton, I think that completes our presentation, and our team is more than happy to answer any questions the board may have tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. That's definitely a lot to digest. here, and before I open up, I just want to say I'm just so amazed. Like our staff is amazing. You guys are just, I mean, so dedicated through all of this year, and with so much hope moving in the future and in promise. So I'm so excited. So okay, I'm gonna start with Director Simons.
Wow, thank you, everybody. I'm really quite astounded at how much work was done, considering all of the other responsibilities and unexpected efforts that you put in, that you had to accomplish this year. So first of all, just thank you so much to keep this going. I'm really kind of shocked, actually. Thank you for going above and beyond to get this done. And this is really important to keep the momentum going. So dealing with the immediate and the short term, the unknowns, but also looking toward our future and keeping our eye on the future. It's kind of interesting. We had the listening session yesterday because I would have loved to have the public see this session tonight. And then I'm sure there would be a lot of interest and feedback and responding to all of the great plans and ideas and thinking and potential options that were presented tonight. So great progress support. I loved here, I mean, I fantastic across the board. I'll just make a couple comments on a few that stuck out to me so other people can comment. But the career and tech strands, that was really interesting to me. And I loved the thinking on how do we leverage the entire district to create differentiation and more opportunity for our students. So how do we just really leverage that scale for the maximum benefits? I love that thinking, and I think that's really core to our work as one district. While we're one district, we want to leverage that to expand the opportunities to serve all of our students. And then the magnet options, and I've been involved on the CETA side, so I'm hoping that that continues to move forward, and I'm hoping that the school choice survey will help inform some of that work as well. And looking forward to see some of the different options that come forward there, especially around languages and learning about what type of reasons people seek out different curriculum opportunities or unique offerings that we can begin to bring here into our district as well. So great work, everybody. Thank you so much. It's really above and beyond.
Thank you. Director Brooks.
I have a few questions, and yes, thank you everyone who participated in putting this together and presenting today. So I think just going in order, it may have been Ron that talked about this one, but a potential community center. Actually, I'm not sure who mentioned this one, but yeah, a potential community center. And I think it talked about sort of exercise space and a ton of other things. I forgot which page that was on. We're just wondering how we were partnering with cities to perhaps make the most out of what this community center space would potentially look like.
Yeah, Thomas, it's Brian. I mentioned that I was using the community center as an example for what happens when you create a multi-use space, either on current underutilized spaces in your district or specific buildings. We already do some coordination with the cities on where we utilize some of their space at times and they use some of our space at times. I don't know if that's your community question, but that certainly could expand. That's another thing to look at is, are there community spaces that are currently not being utilized in that discussion too? So.
And Brian, I know this next one actually is for you. You talked about, you mentioned briefly that community spaces within our schools are in high demand. And so I was just wondering, does that actually mean that scheduling of those spaces is actually at capacity? And if not, what can we be doing to increase community use of our spaces?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's where I think for our team, then there's also a phase around time. So like the easiest answer to all your questions are, it depends, right? So if you talk winter, our gyms are maxed all the time with basketball. You know what I mean? But then you might hit summer and the gyms are open. I mean, there's things going on, but they're open compared to, November 15th through March 15th. So I think sometimes there's like a time component. So that's where even like early childhood's a good example too, right? You might go over to Arborview in the morning and every single space is being utilized and there's different classes coming in and out from 8 a.m. until noon. And then you might go there at 3 in the afternoon and there's 4 classrooms that are empty. So that's where I think, to me, at least how I conceptualize some of this, is where we're doing this, what you heard tonight, where we're starting to do this cross comparison of how to utilize space, when to utilize space, what are specialty spaces. Then you can kind of overlay on top of one another to maximize the use. That's probably as good as I could summarize that, but I think, like I said, that the initial answer is it depends, and it can be very seasonal. Whereas in the winter, some of our auditoriums might have been a little more open for community use, and this year again is the exception. But typically in the spring, on the weekends, you go to our auditoriums, you're going to see young youth going to dance performances all day, all weekend, from sun up to sundown, right? But it might be more empty in the fall. So I think those are some of the things that I can share off the top of my head, but might look, I'm already kind of, even as I was talking, I was kind of visualizing different ways to show the seasonal use and space use.
All right, thanks, Brian. I actually want to spend some time on, I believe it was page 26. So that was the CTE programming page. So I'm having trouble. So this is the page that lists the 3 different schools or 4 different schools and the CTE focus areas assigned to each of the buildings. And I'm having trouble reconciling in my brain, I think, reality versus perception, and the idea that the zip code that you live in can determine your future and the jobs that you have access to via your network. And so when I look at this list and I see Maple Grove Senior High School with, frankly, the highest paid future careers, business, finance, marketing, engineering, and technology, just wondering what message that sends to kids that are in Park Center Senior High, or I'm sorry, within Brooklyn Center or Brooklyn Park, that would not automatically be zoned for Maple Grove, that maybe would not typically have access to those careers via their personal networks. And the message that it sends when you look at Park Center and the focus area within that building is restaurant and food service management, or Osseo Senior High and automotive services versus, again, business, finance, marketing, and engineering at Maple Grove Senior. So, I mean, maybe this is for Kelly. I'm wondering if you can maybe speak more on the logic behind how those programs were placed in those schools.
Absolutely, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you for the question too. First of all, I think we really have to caution that there's a monetary value assigned to any of these and not to others. The restaurant and food service management is all about management, and I think we can't make an assumption that there's not the equal amount of money or wages to be earned in that as in some of the other programs. Same with construction management. When I went to college, I graduated with a number of people that got their 4-year degrees in construction management and are making a lot of money. So there's all sorts of careers. I know what you're saying about the perception though, right? Yeah, there's all sorts of.
And I don't think that everything you said up to this point was necessary. There is a role in our society for all of these areas.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I thought that there was a question about the wages, so that's why so I'm sorry if I misinterpreted that.
Specific to the wages. It's not just about the wages.
Okay. Okay. Well, I can explain to you certainly how we place the programs there. Many of the programs were already placed there and are very, very well established programs. And in the 10-year forecast, they are very much growing fields, and they were at the top of the list in the 10-year forecast for the entire metro area, actually, when we did our research. But I'll start with Osseo Senior, for example, because you had brought up, about automotive services and the health careers. Those programs are very, very established and well-known programs that already exist at Osseo Senior High. And we already have students from other schools within our own district. For example, a lot of students from Maple Grove Senior and a lot of students from Park Center that already attend those programs at Osseo Senior High. And so our belief in our group was that how would we take those existing programs, or why would we take those existing well-established programs and move them to an entirely different building? That we didn't see a purpose or a necessity in doing that. Those were already established programs, and to uproot them from their building. In fact, if we go to Osseo Senior High and we look at the whole health services area, that would be we could do it, certainly, if that's the direction we want to do. But what our group believed was that it didn't make sense to uproot that program and put it into another school. And the same with Park Center, who's had a very established culinary foods program since I was the principal there. And I can tell you, being the principal there for 10 years, that there was a ton of pride in that program. It didn't feel less than. The students were very, very engaged and prideful about that program. And again, we could move that program, but we've already worked around the facilities and other things over the years to do that programming in those schools. So honestly, Maple Grove Senior High was the school that didn't have established strands. They were the only school that didn't have those established strands already. So when we looked at the forecast and we measured what strands we were already offering and then what the job forecast was, we looked at are there other gaps? So we're offering these 4 strands. Are there other gaps that our students could want to participate in? And that's how we came up with business, finance, and marketing, and engineering technology. And those had the best job forecast trends and the most interest from our students, because robotics is a big interest in all of our schools. And so we knew that there was a huge interest in the engineering component around that. We were intentional when we started our work that we didn't want to offer the same programs at every single building, because we believe that lessened the opportunity for the students. And that's why we spent so much time meeting with transportation, meeting with Laurel in HR, and BJ Ermider, the DLTL coordinator who does our staffing and everything, to see how could we offer 6 very distinctly different programs and make sure that our students could, access all of them. And that, we'd meet a variety of different needs. And so that's, where we ended is, well, what we're proposing. And then, we'll get feedback from you, from the board. But why we ended where we ended is because we already had existing programs. We looked at where our gaps were in comparison to the economic forecast, and we tried to program for that. So, could we move any of the programs? I guess we can do anything, but the programs are already well established in those buildings.
So, you mentioned not wanting to uproot and move the programs to a different building, but it seems like our focus is actually on uprooting our kids out of their communities and driving, in this case, our Brooklyn Center kids clear across town, which I think is a problem. And it's not a coincidence. And I also just want to clarify, because I think you mentioned it a couple more times. I'm not indicating that any of these careers are less than others, but it's also not a coincidence that a headline just yesterday was that Chipotle is offering six-figure salaries for their employees after 3 years. Why was that a headline? Because it's unusual. And so it's not about any of these careers being less than. It's about the fact that for most of my adult life, I've worked in business in corporate America, and we've struggled with diversity and getting people of color into these fields. I now work in government, and we're struggling with the exact same thing. And then I look at something like this, and this is why. Because we're not actively promoting the higher wage fields to our communities of color. We're expecting them to drive clear across town to Maple Grove in order to have access to business. I mean, when the core program within their school is restaurant and food service management, or construction management, or automotive services, I mean, that's what they're getting on a daily basis, and that's what they would tend to have access to. That's probably what they would gravitate toward. So I think there is a perception issue, and I think perception can have a significant impact on reality. And I think that's why I'm struggling with this. And I'm sure that as staff, you spend a ton of time, and there is a ton of logic that went into why you made this decision. I am just seriously concerned and questioning if this is the right approach.
Can I jump in here? Because I had the same exact thoughts that Thomas did when I looked at it, and we didn't speak before this at all. I have personal experience with students that my own children who ended up in fields that, because I was able to help them navigate it, I think we have an underutilization of the brilliance of our scholars of color in STEM fields and in the business field. And we can't assume that every family or every student has the resources to be able to to choose their school necessarily, or to say, I want to be in this program before they develop relationships. I'm curious about in looking at the intersection of our magnet schools and the CETA program and STEAM. We have a really great program at Brooklyn Middle in STEAM, right? Why wouldn't we put some of that technology at Park Center, where kids would move from the STEAM school in Brooklyn Middle into that technology and do some more of that STEAM in Park Center? That seems to me to make more sense, especially since it's not an established program at all. I don't think anyone's saying let's move all of this expensive equipment from Osseo High School to another school because of this. But I think having putting programs in zip codes that perpetuate stereotypes. I mean, my youngest daughter was asked if she's even going to college, and she's getting her PhD right now. My oldest daughter was told that her dad must be working for McDonald's because she's got a Mexican last name. I don't want to be a part of that system as a part of this school district. And I'm not saying that that's intentional by any means. And we have to be over intentional about harm that we might be doing without intending that harm, because whether you intend to harm someone or not, they're harmed. And I feel pretty strongly about this particular thing. And then I'll let Thomas get back to his questions, but I just wanted to throw that out there in support of that concern that I also have.
Okay, go ahead, Thomas, and then Heather had her hand up after you.
Yeah, so this is my last question, or at least for now. We know that as a district, we need more teachers and staff of color. And this is the same way in government agencies across the area. We know that there's a high demand for it. Why aren't we training and promoting education and government careers as an option? Because I'll tell you, growing up, I didn't know that it was an option. And so to me, like that's something that, and also nonprofit, that's something that we should be promoting as well, because at the end of the day, it's better for our community, it's better for our district, and it helps get us to where we need to be. And that's sort of a long-term approach of looking at it. I think right now we're highly focused on trying to capture the small amount of college graduates that happen to be of color, but what are we doing to promote education as what are we doing to not only promote but also prepare our scholars for a career in education or any of the other fields within government and nonprofit? Well, I don't need a response on that. I just think that that's something that we also need to consider as we continue to work toward increasing diversity within our district. I'll go ahead and turn it over to another school board member.
Thanks, Director Brooks. Director Douglas, you had your hand up next, and then Director Simons.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I'll do all of my comments right now because I don't have that many. But first I wanted to say that I really appreciate the thoroughness of the entire presentation and update on our progress this far. It's been very informational, and particularly to have this in a public forum, because I know I actually had conversation with some high school students this last week about some of these same topics. So they're paying attention to these things too. And so like Tanya had said earlier, it would have been nice if we could have had this meeting prior to our listening session, because I think it really brings up some really great and important conversation topics. So I hope that we will be able to do that in the future and have this conversation. I also wanted to say that out of the entire presentation, the one slide that really stood out to me is the same slide that Thomas brought up. The first thing I noticed was this obvious perception issue. But I also think that a lot of the comments that Kelly Parpart made in her response to Thomas's questions are really valuable and important to consider. Having grown up in this district and my family grown up in this district, I know that a lot of these programs are really well established at their schools. I know I actually have family members who have participated in these programs because some of them have been around for decades, and they are really embedded in the culture of the high schools that they're at. And I think that while it's really important to consider perception and diverse perspectives and evaluate this in a really comprehensive way to make sure that we're utilizing our resources in the best way possible for our students and families. I think that's really important. But I also think that one thing that we haven't touched on in this particular part of the conversation is, and Jackie brought up Brooklyn Middle School, which is a fantastic STEM school, and the point about having tech at Park Center. And I think that's a really valid point, but I also wanted to, it reminded me that Brooklyn Middle is part of the Northwest Suburban Integration School District program, which actually doesn't have so if you participate in STEM at Brooklyn Middle School, your high school is not Park Center where you graduate to if you're participating in that art program. You move on to a different school that's actually not in Osseo School District. And the whole reason for that is to create more diversity amongst our schools and within our community and our extended community. And that's exactly what having this type of programming does, is it promotes diversity in one district by allowing students to get involved across the district in areas that are specific to their interests. And so I just think it's important to also consider that perspective in this conversation while we evaluate what's best for our kids. But, I think that the history of our district also really matters. And there's a lot of history, both to Thomas's points and to the existence of the programs and how they've benefited our community. So I just wanted to share that perspective and say thanks again to the team and everybody who's put in so much effort in this update and the work that's gone into getting us to where we are today. So thank you.
Director Simons, you had previously had your hand up. Did you still want to say something?
Yeah, so I know that regarding the teacher question and the kind of consideration of preparing students for career paths, maybe there's some opportunity for some additional information for the board or education about how our different curriculums are preparing students. I thought we previously talked about a grow your own program that we had so while it may not be a strand, I think we might not have that full understanding that there's actually a lot of other curriculum that is preparing our students, though it may not be a strand. And I just want to express the appreciation for an understanding of the degree of investment in incredible assets at some of these programs and schools. But if there are low asset requirements for some of the program strands, maybe those are more flexible, or there could be not entirely duplication, but maybe those could be offered in more than one location because they're low asset. So it doesn't require a lot of physical investment. So that's another option to consider versus just in one place or the other, just what's required in order to make that program happen. So those are my additional comments. Thanks.
I think it might be helpful taking, Tanya, what you just said. If Godfrey maybe spoke to how those courses are still offered in all the buildings. And Godfrey, can you speak to that?
Sure. Good evening. My name is Godfrey Ed Ferrari. I'm the College and Career Coordinator for the district. It's nice to meet and see all of you. Yes, I'm happy that we're talking about this, since this is really what we've discussed this at length during our meetings, and we're looking at some of the financial state right now, and some of us moving towards doing some shake-up, but we realize that it's going to cost money. So then we look at specialization. We all specialize in each building. We have some specialization already. So let's build on that instead of just trying to move things around. So we landed on that aspect. And with that in mind, we came to the realization that these programs, like engineering, we have project lead the way in all three high schools. So students really can take any of those classes in all three high schools. So looking at the specialization piece, we decided to say, okay, instead of trying to move things around, spend more money, break down walls, let's just do this. Then have those kids that wants to probably test some of these programs, they can do it in their buildings. So in business, we have business program, even we have more business program in Park Center. Now, talking about growing your own program, at Park Center, we have the education program that's aligned with St. Cloud State. So that's our pilot, and we're doing that. And the reason why we didn't, it was the COVID pandemic that just derail us from that. Grow your own program. So we have all these programs in all these buildings. It's just that when we talk about strengths, we're looking at opportunity for students, that already got specialized program in their building to see that, and like what other districts are doing right now. They're looking at central of this, central of that. We're looking at having some kind of strand where students can say, okay, I have this in my school already. Let me start looking at it. And like we discussed with the CTE teachers, none of their programs are going away. We're still going to have all these programs in each of these buildings. So in attempts for trying to grow CTE and get more marketing, for some of the programs, some of the great stuff that we are doing, this is the best way to do it. Now, if we and just having these two strands does not mean that's the end of it all. As time goes on, we look at some of the data and we're going to move some things around. We can bring in more programs in all these buildings. So this is just a start. That's just what I can add to it.
Okay, thanks, Godfrey. Director Brooks, your hand is up, and then Director Grady.
So first, thank you for the additional information, Godfrey. I think so. I just wanted to comment on one thing, and it's it was said a couple times that the reason why it's the way that it is because the programs are well established and have been around for decades. I think anytime that is the answer to a question or why things aren't changing, I think that's even more of a reason to change it. Particularly when we know we're in a district where we're failing many of our kids. And I know Heather just raised her hand, Heather, that it was not a knock at you. I just think in general, as we are going about our decision-making processes on whether or not things should change, I think if those words come into any of our minds or come out of any of our mouths, I think that's even more of a reason to find ways to change it. So that's that. And then second, I'll just say that it's one thing to offer classes to scholars. It's another to actively promote a program or a field within the school environment to our scholars. Taking a couple classes doesn't necessarily equate to the same thing as knowing that there's a program, that there's a full program available to them, easy access within their school environment that directly works to prepare them for some of those higher wage fields. So that's the last of my comments. Again, thank you for the additional information, particularly on the Grow Your Own program.
Thank you, Director Brooks. I'm going to go Director Grady, then Director Douglas, and then Superintendent McIntyre.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you, Director Brooks, for bringing attention to programming that reinforces racial and socioeconomic stereotypes within our district. And I appreciate your courage in pointing that out. I don't think the issue is about moving established programs. It's more about providing equitable access to all students. And reading through the Magnet School Review, I mean, it's really clear that we're still missing on diversity and the achievement gap within these specialized programs, and that higher efforts need to be made to make those communities more diverse and to close the achievement gap. But I want to say thank you to everybody who's worked on these reports and been forward thinking and gathering qualitative and quantitative data so that we can pivot from this moment. Sorry, somebody's using my printer. So we can pivot from this moment after a year of COVID to meet the new needs as we are moving forward. And one of the things I really liked, I wanted to point out from the Magnet School report is that this forward thinking vision that we need is that the landscape of public school education is shifting to a system of family choice and engagement, personalized education, and innovative teaching practices. And so while those programs are great within those schools, what I would like to see is that every student at Park Center also has the same equitable access to engineering programs, that they don't have to take a bus to Maple Grove to do. And that is the perception and the reality that we are all as a district trying to mitigate right now.
Thank you, Director Douglas.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that my specific comments, I know, Thomas, you said that your comment was not directed at me, but I think it's important that everybody hears that, understands that my specific comments about these programs being well established is not, I don't think it's being heard in the way that I intended it, which is that having these programs be well established means that they have very specific equipment and space requirements that have been expanded upon and upgraded and built into these physical school sites. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about them being well established, and that moving them would incur significant costs that would then take money and funding away from other initiatives. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say well established, which is also why I said, my very first comment was about how I did notice that the perception on that slide could be exactly what Thomas saw. I 100% noticed that and thought, my first thought was, that doesn't look like what we are trying to do. But I also think that it's really, really important to, especially Tamara, you just brought up some really good points about diversifying our district and how important that is. And I feel that we do need to make sure that we have transportation available for kids to participate in these programs across the district, because that's how we create a feeling of one district and allowing students to expand outside of their neighborhood schools into other parts of our greater community. And so that's just my perspective on that. And I just wanted to share that specific piece about what I meant when I said that these programs are well established. Is it really has more to do with the physical sites where they're being held and the equipment required for them.
Thank you, Superintendent McIntyre.
Director Mosquito Jones, please, you can go first if you'd like.
Hey, I have a few other questions also, so I just want to get back to some of my other questions. I do want to echo everybody's thank you for all of your work. I know how many hours you've spent in working all this, and every time that
Director Mosquito Jones, I'm so sorry. Can I just ask a question? Superintendent McIntyre, was your comment about what we were just talking about? Or
yeah, I was just going to offer some insight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Jackie? Just real quick. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And really, we do appreciate all the perspectives. That's what makes us stronger. We see things differently. And just some things I would offer. Our jobs are bringing you recommendations, board members, and if you direct us to go another direction, that's what we'll do, right? So our hope is we bring you a professional analysis of things, and I think I don't want it to be lost on what was looked at, some forecasting on what the job market might be demanding of our students in years to come. And then also, we really started with that premise of we simply won't be able to replicate every strand in every high school. We won't be able to, no one can afford that, and it's really challenging. So our thought was, how do we offer multiple pathways, multiple choices for students? And then I think a couple of you said it really well, how do we better market, promote, and engage and attract students to those different careers? Now, it could be a different strand, right? That may be the direction to go in, but I think the concept of multiple throughout the district is expands our choices and options for our students in our district. And always starting with, we have a core program driven by state standards first. These are additional specialty areas. These are not the only thing that'll happen in the building. So they're addition to the core program we offer at every building. And there's a number of examples across the metro where multiple high schools in a district offer different programs at different high schools to really expand the choice offerings. Now, do we have the right choices? That's probably at the heart of the matter is, are we landing on the ones that we can all get behind? And maybe that takes more analysis as well. So hopefully some of those thoughts can resonate as well, as you kind of, as we all wrestle with, you know, how do we move forward with this? And we keep coming back to what do we think future trends look like? And if the, you know, again, the board directs us to go another direction on what's offered at each school, then we'll explore that. That is our job. So thank you, Chair Dawson Walton, for letting me just jump in there. Sorry, Jackie.
Thank you. And okay, Director Mosqueda Jones, you can go, and then I'll go back to Tamara, and then I'll say something too.
Fantastic, thank you, I appreciate it. I just want to also reiterate that every time that I do any kind of pushback, it's in the interest of us all working together to do what's best for all of our students. So a few things that I'm thinking and or asking questions about when we're looking at our flexible seating and spaces. I want to make sure that we're including students in that, ESPs, OTs, PTs, language, different age levels. What I want to avoid is, from personal experience, teachers coming into the room and finding a piece of equipment that would never work for that particular age level. Why someone would put a cushion in my classroom that is the same height as a 4-year-old, I have no idea. But apparently they needed to think that one again. And I can't even imagine how expensive that was. So that's one piece that I want to throw in. One thing, when Brian was talking, he said he could that he could fill a couple of 4-stars just with the waiting list. And I wonder, because 4-star is a self-sustaining program, correct, Brian? So it's full cost. It's full cost pre-K. And then we have voluntary pre-K, which you have to qualify for, correct? Yep. So we have a whole section of families in pre-K that don't have access to a program through our school district. And so I'm wondering if there's ever been any kind of, and maybe Brian might have this information, of people asking for pre-K that just don't either qualify or can't afford it. Are you seeing like or they just don't because they know we don't have it?
Yeah, I think I understand your question, Jackie. I believe that some of these expansion, I'll call it funding streams for pre-K, was in an effort to address that very thing. Like, are there people who are interested in it but couldn't pay market rate for it? Now, you know, we have some of our, boy, that's a big question you're asking, because we have some of our, for lack of better terms, fully funded pre-Ks that don't fill up, right? We still work hard to even ensure that those spaces fill up. So
yeah, so my question around that is, in my experience, I'm currently teaching full day voluntary pre-K right now. That fills up. It's in my district, for that to fill up by February during a COVID year, that tells you something, because I would be schlepping for students in November for my half-day class. So just some things to think about. I know we don't have the money or the funding right now, but when we're talking about trying to attack that opportunity gap, there's a whole slew of students that we're not addressing. And so I was wondering if that was going to be part of our survey with the families. The other thing I was thinking about the survey is, could some of the things that come back from the survey with the community influence some of these strands that we're talking about? My guess is probably, and you don't need to answer that right now, but just something to throw in the hopper, as well as if we're going to have different strands across the district, I want to make sure that we're very intentional with our academic counseling of our students and families to make sure that they're aware of these programs and have the ability to do whatever program that they choose to do. And for families that are experiencing homelessness or stressors that may get in the way of being able to access that, to make sure that we're meeting them there. And then just a note about the magnet programs. I was here when we started those because of the having racially isolated schools. And in the beginning, there were tracks of, if you go to this elementary school, then you go to this middle school, and then you go to this high school. That's changed throughout the years. And so it may or may not be true that if students go to Brooklyn Middle, that they go to another school after that. And when I was on Northwest Suburban Integration School District, it looked like not as many people as we think go through that track, because you have a choice at every level whether or not you continue with that. So I just want to put that into the, into the space of when we're thinking about what we're offering on which side of the district, and how we can get particularly interested in getting more brilliant students who are historically excluded or underserved into the STEM fields. Just knowing that my daughter is the only Black woman in her PhD chemistry program, just, it's a special passion of mine. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me push back a little bit. On to the next person.
Thank you, Director Grady.
I'm good. Thank you for a robust conversation about this, about reducing the barriers and watching them when they do come up. And I look forward to seeing how this unfolds as we move forward, and being really intentional about making sure that every student's needs get met, and that they're aware of all the programs that we do have, and make sure that they're accessible.
Thank you. And Director Douglas, is your hand up now or from prior?
Sorry, that must have been from earlier.
And same with you, Superintendent McIntyre. Is it now? No. Okay. Okay, so I just want to say, I thank you all, like even our board members, like for such a great conversation. It's a challenging conversation. Kelly, I want you to know, like, I feel like, of course, your part, we're all really, focused on, and it's obviously not you. It's just I think we need to have these conversations. We need to get out in the open. I did, in all full disclosure, when I saw that too, I was like, wait, what? I think that, we've seen the articles, right? We see the reports, the stark disparities that have plagued Minnesota are just astronomical in pretty much most every area. And namely, around employment and economic mobility and housing and education. And I really am not satisfied with it's not about, to me, like the current programs, but we keep saying we're taking this year and the times and thinking what's changing, and this is really the time to think big, right? And with all of our different tracks of gaining feedback and engagement, I think this is the time that we really want to explore that, because these pathways are critical to the future of our society. It really is. And it's concerning to me if we don't kind of take this opportunity and take this conversation and really explore it a little deeper. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because I understand there's resources that need to be, potentially allocated, but who knows who it's going to happen in the future with the legislature, but then also beyond that, the direction and what we're seeing in our, so I really do share Thomas's sentiments around that conversation, and I would like to explore this further, Superintendent McIntyre. And as far as the rest of it, I mean, truly, there's so much kind of left hanging that I'm so interested in, especially around kind of exploring our spaces. I think that the various programming, whether it's early learning or just through our face program or department or division, I don't know, I can't remember what it's called, but really bringing that engagement arm into it to hear from all of our different committees and groups, and as we bring students voices forward. I mean, I really think that it's really exciting work, and again, it leaves a lot kind of hanging. You want more, but anyways, I thank you so much for your time tonight and for the amount of work that's gone into this and just being a small part of it. I just can't say enough about each of you that were involved, because I think that it's been a lot of your professional expertise and experience has really shined through in this moment. So thank you, and I will hand it back over to you, Superintendent McIntyre, if you have anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, just thank you very much for everyone's thoughts on this, and it's helpful to hear your feedback. I know I first sent the first draft of these strands out March 12th and really didn't get much feedback until tonight. So this has been a helpful conversation to help guide our team. And I think probably the next steps, we'll go back and reevaluate this, but we're probably going to look at how do we get additional input from community, parents, and students, and see what there's different options out there beyond maybe these here, and that will probably delay our work, but I think we got to get it right. So we'll have to go back and think about what those options are. Kelsey asked kind of where do we go from here, and I think we just need to get more voice and perspectives to see if we're on the right path or if we need to explore some different options to move this forward. But it's the exact example why we're definitely recommending focusing on the renewals first. I know we haven't talked much about that, but we got to address our operating and tech levy renewals. And then we can, Russell, continue to unpack and study and evaluate and come up with recommendations on anything that might require a bond or a referendum asked to fund whatever we land on, right? And that's going to not likely be ready by November 22. So the time piece, it's showing, it's vibrant to me right now as the kind of work that it'll require. So I appreciate the different perspectives tonight, and I want to echo you all said it. Our team's found time with all the other things we've been involved in all year to make space in our weekly calendars, as you saw the number of meetings, to really try to dive into this work and keep the commitment you made as a board moving forward. Last June, you made that commitment, and trying to keep this moving forward. So it's exactly why we do a check-in and update, to get a spot check and have the board give us direction. And hopefully, we find an area or an approach to this that everyone can get behind. So I think we just got more work to do and more evaluation to complete and more perspectives to seek. So I know it's been a long evening and it's been valuable feedback for us, and we'll go back and kind of regroup and then come back with some other options, and you can give us new direction if there needs to be. So we'll just continue through that process. But I think I just want to echo the process is solid, and the approach and the analysis, I think, is going to serve us well in the end, right? So it's gotten us to this point, and it'll continue to serve us as we can, really land on what exactly is it we need to give our students what they need to be successful in life beyond us, beyond whatever they choose to do when they leave our system, and be successful at whatever they want that to be. So I think with that, I don't think I have any more tonight. And this is why we only had 2 agenda items. We wouldn't have had time for a third one tonight. So we'll continue to keep you up to date on this work and bring it back when we have something of substance to get some more direction from the board on. So I know you've had a lot of meetings this month, this week. Appreciate the board's time. It's a busy time of the year. The end of the year we're right at the end, and everyone's been working really hard. So I'm grateful for everyone's attention and time and effort that's been put into not only tonight, but a lot of other work that's happening right now. So thank you, Chair Dawson, and thank you, board members. I think that's it for tonight. So thank you very much.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night.